On the left, I have two screenshots of the Google homepage, one of the regular search homepage and the other of the images search homepage. On my right, I have a Flutter app that I have coded with a layout similar to the Google homepage. In it, I have put an app bar at the top, a search section at the center, and an options section at the bottom. Let's code this app from scratch. We start off with a blank VS Code window. I'll go ahead and open the folder I have created specifically for this demo. Next, I'll go to this menu here and open the terminal from here, and I'll use the Flutter create demo_app command to create a new project inside a folder called demo_app. We can see that our project has been created. I'll create a new folder inside this project. I'll call it images, and here's where I'm going to put the image that we're going to use as the account profile image. I'll open up this folder in the file explorer, then I'll go over to my collection of images, get the profile image from there and paste it in this images folder. Next, I'll go to this pubspec.yml file. I'll scroll to the assets section and comment this code and remove some of this code so that we remain with only a line that points to the images folder. I have also added this .vscode folder here with this settings.json file, mostly to keep the IntelliSense pop-ups from showing up as I write the code. Let's now go over to the main.dat file to start writing our code. I'll start by setting this device to Chrome so that later on we are able to run this app on the browser. Next, I'll change the title of the app, remove the theme because we don't need it, remove the debug banner, remove the comments, and remove some of this code so that we remain with only a blank scaffold. I'll set the background color property of the scaffold to white, and then move on to the app by itself, which I'm going to put inside the app bar property of the scaffold. For this, I will create an app bar widget whose background color I will set to white. I'll now move on to the menu icon, which I will put inside the leading property of the app bar. And for this, I'm going to use an icon button widget whose icon I will set to the menu icon, and the onPressed property will have a function. Inside this onPressed function, we will need to call a function that will show us a dummy menu page. So I'll need to create a function for showing dummy pages at the top here. It will return void. I will call it show dummy page, and it will take a string argument, which will be the page title. Inside this function, I will call the show dialog function, where I will set the context to the context. And for the builder property, we will have a function that takes the context as an argument and returns a full screen dialog. The child of this dialog will be a column with two children. The first will be an align widget whose alignment will be set to top right. And the child of this align widget will be an icon button that shows the close icon, and when pressed, it calls the pop method of the navigator to close the dialog. The second child will be a center widget whose child will be a text widget that displays the page title argument that was passed into this function, and we will give it a text style to set the font size to 30. We will call this show dummy page function inside the onPressed function of the menu icon button, and we will pass in the string dummy menu as the argument. Next, let's move on to the all and images search mode buttons. We will put them in a row inside the title property of the app bar. For the all search mode button, we will use an inkwell widget to make it clickable. The child of this inkwell will be a column whose children are first a sized box at the top for spacing, whose height will be 20 pixels, and then a text widget that says all. We will give this widget a style property, and we will assign a text style to it, where we will set the font size to bold and the font size to 14. The color of this text will depend on whether the search mode is all or images. If the search mode is all, this text will be blue. If the search mode is images, this text will be black. So I'll need to create a string variable at the top here, which I will call search mode, and I will initialize it as all. And so for the color property of this text widget, I will use a ternary function where if the search mode is all, then the color will be a shade of blue, which I will use a hex value to define. Otherwise, the color will be black. Next, I will create the dash that is displayed underneath the all text if the search mode is all. And for this, I will use a container with a top margin of 15 pixels, a width of 45 pixels, a height of 3 pixels. And for the color property, I'll use a ternary function where if the search mode is all, then the color will be a shade of blue, which I will use a hex value to define. Otherwise, the color will be white, which makes it practically invisible. In the onTap property of the inkwell, we're going to use a setState function to set the search mode to all, so that when we click on this button, the search mode changes to all and the app refreshes its UI to reflect this change. After this inkwell, we will have a sized box for spacing whose width will be 30 pixels, and then we move on to the images search mode button. For this, we will use an inkwell widget whose child will be a column widget. The first child of this column will be a sized box for spacing, and we will give it a height of 20 pixels. After that, we'll have a text widget that says images, and we will assign a text style to it to set the font weight to bold and the font size to 14 pixels. For the color property, if the search mode is images, then the color will be a shade of blue, which I will use a hex value to define. Otherwise, the color will be black. For the dash that will be displayed underneath the images text, if the search mode is images, we will use a container with a top margin of 15 pixels, a width of 70 pixels, a height of 3 pixels, and for the color property, if the search mode is images, the color will be a shade of blue, which I will use a hex value to define. Otherwise, the color will be white, which makes it invisible. In the ontop property of this images inkwell, we will use a setState function to set the search mode to images. Let me pull up this image here for reference so that we see how far we are in this process. So here's the text mode or the all mode screenshot. And so far we have our menu button here, we have our all button, and we have our images button. We're now moving on to the apps icon button, and then after that we'll have the account icon button, and with that the app bar will be complete. So let's move on to the apps icon button. We will put all of these remaining icon buttons inside the actions property of the app bar. For the apps icon, we will use an icon button whose icon will be the apps icon, and in the onPressed property, we will have a function. When we press the apps icon, we will need to show a dummy pop-up. So at the top here, I'll create a function for showing dummy pop-ups. It will return void. I will call it show dummy pop-up, and it will take a string argument, which I will call pop-up title. Inside this function, I'll call the show dialog function, where I'll set the context property to the context. And for the builder property, I will create a function that takes the context as an argument and returns an alert dialog widget. The content of this dialog will be a column with only one child, which is a centered text widget that displays the pop-up title, and we will give it a text style to set the font size to 30. I'm using a column so that we display a full-sized pop-up, which in the Google homepage is filled with app icons. I'll call this show dummy pop-up function inside the onPressed property of the apps icon button, and I will pass in dummy apps menu as the argument. After the apps icon, we will have a sized box for spacing, which will have a width of 10 pixels, and then we'll move on to the account icon. For this, we will use an icon button whose icon will be a circle avatar that displays the image in our images folder. For this, we will use an asset image to which we will pass the path to this image, and in the onPressed property of this icon button, we will have a function that calls the show dummy page function, and we'll pass dummy account page as the argument. We're done writing the code for the app bar. So now let's move on to the main page content, which will consist of this text here, this search bar, and this text at the bottom here. We will put the main page content inside the body property of the scaffold, and for this we will use a column widget whose first child will be a sized box for spacing, and its height will be a 1/7 of the screen height. For the colored title, we will use a stack widget at the bottom of which we will have the colored title, and on top of that, if we are in images search mode, then we will have the text that says images. For the multicolored title, we will use a row whose main axis alignment will be set to center so that everything is centered horizontally. Its children will be 3 text widgets. The first will say T, its font size will be 60, its font weight will be bold, and its color will be a shade of green, which I will use a hex value to define. The second text widget will say F, its font size will be 60, its font weight will be bold, and its color will be a shade of yellow, which I will use a hex value to define. And the third text widget will say C, its font size will be 60, its font weight will be bold, and its color will be a shade of red, which I will use a hex value to define. For the images text badge, we will use an if statement where if the search mode is images, we will display a container with a top margin of 65 pixels and a left margin of half the screen width so that it is always slightly off center. And the child of this container will be a text widget that says images with a text style to set the color to a shade of blue, which I will define using a hex value. After this multicolored title, we will have a sized box with a height of 30 pixels for spacing, and then we move on to the search bar. For this, we will use a container widget whose width will be the screen width minus 30 pixels so that this search bar expands and contracts along with the window as it gets resized. And for the decoration property, we will have a box decoration where we'll set the border radius to 30 pixels and we will give it a border all round whose color will be gray. The child of this container will be a row widget whose first child will be a sized box with a width of 20 pixels for spacing. then we will have the search text field. For this, we will use an expanded widget whose child will be a text form field widget, and in its decoration property, we will have an input decoration where we will set the icon to the search icon and the border to none. For the microphone icon, we will use an icon button widget whose icon will be the mic icon. Its color will be a shade of blue, which we will use a hex value to define, and in the onPressed property, we will have a function that calls the show dummy pop-up function and passes dummy microphone menu as the argument. For the lens icon, we will use an icon button widget whose icon will be the camera underscore alt underscore outlined icon. Its color will be a shade of blue, which we will use a hex value to define, and in the onPressed property, we will have a function that calls the show dummy page function, and we will pass dummy lens page as the argument. After the lens icon button, we will have a sized box with a width of 20 pixels for spacing, and then we will put a sized box with a height of 30 pixels for spacing underneath the search bar, and then we'll move on to the language change text. For this, we will use a row widget whose main axis alignment property will be set to center, and its children will be first a text widget which says TFC offered in, and then an equal widget whose child will be a text widget which says Kiswahili with a text style that sets the color to a shade of blue, which we will use a hex value to define. In the onTap property of this equal, we will have a function that calls the show dummy page function, and we will pass dummy languages page as the argument. We're done writing the code for the main content of the page. Now we'll move on to the bottom section of the page, where we'll have this text widget here, a divider, and these buttons at the bottom. We will put the bottom section inside the bottom sheet property of the scaffold. For this, we will use a container widget whose width will be the screen width. We will give it the color gray with a shade of 100, and its child will be a column widget whose main axis size will be set to minimum so that it occupies the minimum space possible. Its cross-axis alignment property will be set to start so that it arranges its children starting from the far left. The first child of this column will be the Kenya label. For this, we will use a padding widget with a left padding of 10 pixels, a top padding of 10 pixels, and a bottom padding of 5 pixels. And the child of this padding widget will be a text widget that says Kenya with the font size set to 18. After the padding widget, we will have a divider widget and then a sized box with a height of 5 pixels for spacing, and then we'll move on to the options section. Here we will also have a padding widget with a symmetric horizontal padding of 30 pixels, and the child of this padding widget will be a row widget whose main axis alignment property will be set to space evenly. The first child of this row will be the themes button. We will use an equal widget whose child will be a text widget that says that theme off, and in the onTap property we will call the show dummy page function and pass dummy themes page as the argument. For the settings button, we will use an equal widget whose child will be a text widget that says settings, and in its onTap property, we will call the show dummy pop-up function and pass dummy settings menu as the argument. For the privacy button, we will use an equal widget whose child will be a text widget that says privacy, and in its onTap property, we will call the show dummy page function and pass dummy privacy page as the argument. For the terms button, we will use an equal widget whose child will be a text widget that says terms, and in its onTap property, we will call the show dummy page function and pass dummy terms page as the argument. After the padding widget containing the row of options, we will have a sized box with a height of 15 pixels for spacing. And that's it. We're done writing the code for this app. So let's go to this menu, go to the run option and click on start debugging so that we can build this app to see what it looks like, and also so that we can see how the different icon buttons and equal widgets respond when we click on them. Our app has now been built. So let's close this panel right here. Let's also close this inspector tab and this debug console. Let me also bring up these two images so that we're able to have a side-by-side comparison between the images and our app. At the top here, we have our app bar. Our menu button works as expected. Our buttons for switching between the all and images search modes also work as expected. Our apps icon button also works as expected, and the account icon button pulls up the dummy account page. Onto the main content of the page, the search bar also works as expected. We're able to type Flutter courses. The microphone icon button pulls up the dummy microphone menu, and the camera icon pulls up the dummy lens page. This microphone icon should be in blue, so let's make a quick fix. Let's scroll up to the mic icon section. Underneath the icon property, we will add the color property. And here we will have a color, which we will use a hex value to define, and the color will be similar to that of the lens icon below it. Let's save and hot reload this. And now our icon is blue. So let's pull up our reference images. At the bottom here, we have the text for changing language, and we click on that, we see that we pull up the dummy languages page. At the bottom here, we have the Kenya text, and then a divider, and then the 4 options buttons. The themes button pulls up the themes page, the settings button pulls up the settings pop-up, the privacy button pulls up the privacy page, and the terms button pulls up the terms page. So that's how you build an app layout in Flutter that is similar to the Google homepage. If you have enjoyed this video and found value in it, be sure to give it a thumbs up and share it with someone who might find it useful as well. And if you haven't already, subscribe to this channel with the notifications turned on so that you get notified every time I upload a new video.